David became a pioneer of the Kingdom of Tiran and owned his own territory, becoming a village chief under the rule of the kingdom. Although the territory is a bit remote, crops are not easy to grow, the climate is also relatively cold, and this newly established village is currently only him, but David believes that these difficulties can be overcome. David. My territory is open to the heavens and all realms. This time, I won't go find you. Come over. Keywords of the novel. Empire Era from scratch without pop-ups. Download the complete TXT collection of Empire Era from scratch, and read the latest chapters of Empire Era from scratch. Chapter 1. Fresh Village Chief. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. Fresh Village Chief. David lowered his left hand, holding the hunting bow with a joyful expression on his face, and quickly walked through the forest with his agile hands. In the blink of an eye, he arrived at his prey. A deer that had fallen to the ground with several arrows in its body. Crouch down and place the hunting bow aside, draw out the dagger to deliver a fatal blow to the undead prey, and then move the still hot deer meat onto the rough back frame. The entire process is completed in one go and is very skilled. Hey! After taking a breath, David stood up with force. He struggled to stand up straight with his back brace, and the weight on his back brace was much heavier than he had expected. The strength has decreased significantly, I hope it can recover quickly. Not long after entering the forest, David obtained dozens of pounds of deer meat. He is very satisfied with today's harvest. If his luck has been so good, he should be able to recover to normal soon. Carrying a hunting bow and a quiver filled with arrows, David walked towards his home outside the forest. David, originally an ordinary office worker on Earth, came to this world after passing away at a young age for some reason. According to his observation, this is a fantasy world similar to the Middle Ages in Europe. The strictly divided class system also made him very uncomfortable, because he was only a commoner in this lifetime. After being raised by an old hunter named Addis until the age of 16, David, who was unwilling to do so, became a pioneer. In order to increase its territory, the Kingdom of Tiran encouraged civilians to become pioneers and develop land without human habitation. Pioneers who successfully develop and occupy new lands can break away from their civilian status and become knights or even noble lords. However, expanding territory was not an easy task. After several months of trekking to choose a place of residence and more than a year and a half of cultivation work, David's team was unable to cultivate qualified farmland. Combined with factors such as harsh weather, attacks from wild animals, lack of food and medicine, and unrewarded hard work, some people passed away or gave up one after another. By the end of the following winter, only David was left. He naturally took over the development certificate and became the village head of this newly built village. However, after struggling through the second winter, David also began to consider leaving here. This deer should be able to help me recover and make some jerky. It would be even better if I could find some wild vegetables. Carrying the main food for the next few days, David slowly walked back to this temporary village with only 4 large wooden houses. One of the 4 wooden houses was a warehouse, also a blacksmith's workshop, and the kitchen of the entire team. David carried deer meat into the wooden house and placed it on a seemingly simple table, starting various treatments. Peeling, removing organs, cutting and cleaning various parts of the meat. After he was busy with all of this, he cooked himself some meat soup. He had no shortage of seasonings, and when the development team set off, he would bring enough salt, sugar, and spices, which were still quite a few. Sitting on a makeshift wooden stool outside the cabin, holding a wooden bowl and drinking meat soup, David looked at the vast river to the west and pondered his future. Is it to explore another village? Or a crisp and neat return to Iron Tree Castle? Go back to Iron Tree Castle and honestly become an ordinary hunter? I always feel a bit unwilling. Just as I was thinking about these things, a faint figure appeared not far ahead. That figure was vague and elusive, even in broad daylight, David couldn't see the other person's appearance clearly. What's going on? Damn it. The semi-transparent figure reminded David of ghosts, undead spirits, Nya Xiaoqian, and others. Just as he put down his wooden bowl and took the bow and arrow at hand, hoping to boost his courage, the figure gradually became clear and revealed its true appearance. This design. The dirty camisole vest, work pants with leather boots, ponytails, and the high appearance covered in dirty mud and water cannot be concealed, coupled with the staggering appearance of clutching the waist with this design, if paired with the wind and rain, the cold wind piercing through the bones, and the continuous rain and water flowing down the mountain walls, David would suspect that he has crossed again. What he saw was clearly the famous beautiful archaeologist. After graduating from university, she became an archaeologist, but none of the relics she had excavated could be fully preserved, so she was also known as the Tomb Destroyer, the god of demolition, and so on. Now, she is just a rookie who has just graduated from college and has truly participated in archaeological activities for the first time. In this seemingly ordinary archaeological activity, I encountered a shipwreck on an island and encountered a series of strange things. The story of helping a partner successfully escape and gradually grow after experiencing various hardships. The one in front of David should be in the early stages of the story. Standing up, David watched as he slowly walked into the village, scrutinizing those who also showed signs of doubt, ready to try a conversation. After so many years, he didn't know how many more English sentences he could remember. When he was struggling to remember a few English sentences, Crawford across from him had already noticed him and stopped a few meters away from David. Now the two of them are not far apart, and with ample daylight, David in this lifetime has no problems with myopia or astigmatism. He can clearly see the surprise, doubt, and guard on Crawford's face. Hello, David habitually used the universal human language of this world. Do you need any help? Hello. Crawford couldn't understand what the young man across from him was saying. However, after careful examination, I realized that this seemingly righteous young man should not have any ill intentions towards him. Therefore, I waved my hand and greeted David, saying, I need some help. This listening question is not difficult and he can understand it himself, but how to answer it makes him a bit scratching his head. Putting the bow and arrow aside, David walked up to Crawford. After seeing David put down his weapon, he confirmed that the person had no ill intentions towards him, and Crawford immediately said a lot. This gave David a headache and he could only vaguely understand a few words. In the end, he had to extend his finger to the wound that Crawford was covering, interrupting the other person's words. In the story, Crawford fell into the sea during a shipwreck, and although he tried his best to swim to the shore, he was directly knocked unconscious by someone. After waking up, he was hung upside down in a cave. Although Crawford escaped with his own wisdom and courage, he was also injured as a result, with a penetrating injury to his waist being the most severe. It's hard to imagine that Crawford, a young girl who doesn't look very strong, could carry such injuries to snow-capped mountains, climb grasslands, and destroy the entire Sun Brotherhood, the mysterious boss, Queen Bimihu, and numerous storm guardians. Considering that the metal that pierced into the waist was covered in rust at the time, and Crawford's subsequent performance. Even an empty-handed Crawford's combat power was definitely over 5. At this moment, Crawford, with astonishing combat power, was in a very weak state. Following the direction pointed by David, she lowered her head and looked at her waist. Blood was constantly oozing from between her fingers. She knew it was not the time to talk nonsense, and she also understood that the other party did not understand English. However, simple words should be understandable, right? I tried to say, I need help. Medicine. Crawford watched as the young man in front of him took out something from his waist bag. A small bag and a cloth roll that looked like a bandage. After the other party opened the small bag, Crawford saw the powdered substance inside, which seemed to be some kind of medicinal powder. It seemed that his attempt had been successful. Taking out the medicine powder and homemade bandage that he always carried with him, David made a few more movements towards Crawford. First pointing to his own eyes, then pointing to the location of Crawford's wound, and finally lifting the medicine powder and bandage in his hand. Crawford understood the other person's meaning, hesitated for a few seconds, then nodded and lifted his vest slightly to reveal the injured area. Her movements touched the wound, and the sudden pain made Crawford snort softly. David looked at Crawford's waist, which was covered in blood stains and couldn't tell his true skin color. It was impossible to apply medication directly in this state. Hand the medicine powder and bandage in his hand to Crawford, and David pointed to the wooden chair next to the cabin and made a "wait a moment" gesture. The simple gesture was easy for Crawford to understand. He sat on the wooden chair with powder and bandages, and watched as David turned around and entered the cabin. Soon, he walked out with a basin of water and understood the other person's meaning. Sitting obediently on the wooden chair, Crawford watched as the enthusiastic young man in front of her wiped her waist and abdomen with a damp cloth. Suddenly, she felt strange. She should have cleaned it herself. It seemed a bit inappropriate to speak now, and she thought the other person didn't understand her words. David carefully helped Crawford wipe the wound, and with his movements, all the mud, water, and blood were wiped away, revealing Crawford's snow-white waist and abdomen with muscular lines. Feeling the slippery and delicate sensation emanating from his fingers, David, who had not tasted meat for over a decade, felt a surge of heat rising in his body. Cough. He restrained his mind and threw the cloth stained with blood and mud aside. Then, he picked up the medicine powder and bandage from Crawford's hand and neatly bandaged his wound. In the past 2 years, his bandage techniques have greatly improved. After he finished these things, he stood up and nodded at Crawford. At this moment, Crawford also stood up, checked the bandage on his waist and abdomen, and lifted his head. He sincerely thanked David. "Thank you very much for your help." "You're welcome." As soon as the words were spoken, both of them were stunned. Because David is no longer speaking the language that Crawford has never heard before, but rather the English she is very familiar with, which is also her most familiar British English. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. A Passing Archaeologist. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2. A Passing Archaeologist. Do you know English? It seems like it will happen suddenly. David was also puzzled. He tried to think for a moment and found that he could easily apply English knowledge, which was not much different from thinking in his mother tongue. This is by no means my previous level of English proficiency, but rather a sudden acquisition of English knowledge. It seems unbelievable, but as a traveler, David doesn't find anything strange. Having experienced various brain teasers in his past life, he immediately understood what was going on. The golden finger has been credited. Looking at Crawford suddenly appearing in front of him, he had already made some guesses about what was wrong with his golden finger. Although golden finger arrived a bit late and kept him waiting for so many years, it was better than never. But why does it appear at this time? Have you undergone any significant changes recently? Did you wait until you were 18 years old to open it? David joined the development team at the age of 16 and stayed in this remote place for 2 years. He happens to be 18 years old this year. Besides, the biggest change is the identity. Upgraded from an ordinary person to a village chief. When it comes to the sudden appearance of Crawford and the English proficiency that should have been acquired from him, he tends to lean towards the latter possibility. Time travel. Although someone else came looking for him, it's not surprising. In his past life, he had also attracted the imagination of various passers-by by opening shops, hotels, and clinics, so it is not uncommon for him to become a village chief and have passers-by within his territory. It is not difficult to judge whether one's guess is correct, just see if there will be any familiar people suddenly appearing. In that case, the village chief still has to persevere in his work. David, who was thinking this way in his heart, looked at Crawford again, his face full of suspicion. This is very normal. Anyone who hears the other person say, "It will happen suddenly," will not immediately believe it. Besides, Crawford has just experienced a shipwreck, was knocked unconscious, kidnapped, and hung in a cave, so he will definitely be wary of strangers. Although it sounds unbelievable, what I said is true. David could only emphasize with a serious expression that he was not lying. Crawford carefully looked at David and was finally convinced by his overflowing sense of justice. He decided to believe his lies and said, "Okay. So, can you tell me where this is? Who are you?" Crawford, who had treated the wound well, felt much more comfortable all over. Although he was still a bit weak, he was no longer as uncomfortable as he had just been. It wasn't until then that she had the thought to focus on other issues. Where exactly is this? How did you get here? How do I meet my friends on my own? When talking to David just now, she carefully examined the surrounding environment. No matter how you look at it, this is a plain. How did she manage to get here from the mountain in the blink of an eye? She also felt very puzzled by the huge changes in climate. This is the pioneer camp located in the northwest of the northern plain of the Iron Tree Forest. I am David, the village chief here. Hello, David. I'm Crawford, an archaeologist who got lost in a shipwreck and ended up here unexpectedly. Crawford thought this was a very commonplace name, but as for the northern plains, it's more common. What is the Iron Tree Forest? The Iron Tree Forest is located northwest of Iron Tree Castle, which is the most important town in the northern part of the Kingdom of Tiran. Iron Tree Castle. Tiran Kingdom. Where is Tiran Kingdom? David looked at Crawford, who was full of doubts, and continued to tell him what he knew. The Kingdom of Tiran is a human kingdom located in the northern part of the continent. At this time, they were in a plain area further north of the Iron Tree Fortress, an important town in the northern part of the Tiran Kingdom. Due to the barrier of the Tiran Mountains and the elves living in the Iron Tree Forest with extremely poor human relations with the Tiran Kingdom was unable to occupy this vast plain area until the development team formed 2 years ago arrived here. David is one of the 3 newly established pioneer camps that wants to cultivate this land. If everything goes smoothly, it should develop into a new village and include this land in the territory of the Kingdom of Tiran. What? As David narrated, the question mark on Crawford's head kept increasing, as if it was about to completely overwhelm her. However, she persisted in not interrupting David's account until he finished speaking the general situation before saying, "You were actually telling a story, weren't you?" "No," David spread his hand and put on a serious face, indicating that he was telling the truth. How could this be possible? If David's description is true, it means that Crawford has stumbled into another world. Although David's description is rough, the distance traveled by the Trailblazer team after leaving Iron Tree Castle in David's words indicates that this is definitely not a small island. Crawford opened his mouth and remained silent for a while, completely unsure of how to describe the current situation. It wasn't until the hunger in his stomach brought her back to her senses that he said, "This is really unbelievable." She asked more about local customs and learned about some of the cultural customs of this world. She also learned that there are mysterious powers and races in this world, just like in fantasy stories, and accepted the fact that she really came to another world. At this moment, Crawford suddenly thought of another question. "Aren't the questions I asked you strange?" "No." After so long, David had enough time to come up with a suitable statement. "The way you appeared made me realize that your background would be very special." Describing the peculiar state in which Crawford appeared, Crawford now understood why David appeared so calm, because the other party did not treat her as an ordinary person from the beginning. "So it's like this." After solving various doubts, Crawford felt a slight pain in his head. Can she still go back? Although this world is magical, it fills her with an interest in adventure. But now is not a good time for adventure. She is very worried about her companions. They have just encountered a shipwreck, and she doesn't know what everyone's situation is at this moment. Can we escape the disaster safely? Crawford, filled with worries in her heart, didn't notice that David cooked broth for Crawford to cook dinner during her silent time, and only regained consciousness when the steaming broth was handed to her. "Thank you." Crawford sincerely thanked David as he looked at the fragrant broth in his hand. "Fortunately, I met you." "You're welcome." David replied with a bright smile from Crawford, and his mood is good now. After all, Crawford's appearance means he has a golden finger and the motivation to continue working hard in this place. Besides, Crawford himself is a beautiful woman with both appearance and figure. How could a normal person not want to see a beautiful woman? Crawford, who had quickly finished a bowl of broth, noticed that David was just standing by and looking at him. Suddenly, he felt a bit embarrassed and said, "Aren't you going to eat?" After asking, she remembered the situation of the campsite that David had previously introduced. He was already the only one left and there was a shortage of supplies. "Is there not enough food?" "No, I had just finished eating before you came," David explained. "I was lucky and caught a deer during the day." "That's good." After confirming that she hadn't eaten the other party's limited food reserves, Crawford's worries were relieved. Then she asked about the environment around the village. She wants to confirm if there is anything special near this village, otherwise how could she suddenly come here? Perhaps by finding the source of that mysterious power, one can go back. David guessed Crawford's thoughts, but he did not tell the other party that the so-called mysterious power was likely himself. Instead, he bluntly introduced the surrounding environment. To the west of the village was a vast river, and its source should be the mountain peak to the north that could be vaguely seen. The river flows from north to south, then turns west on the west side of their village, and at the same time, there is another river that flows from south to north and is much narrower. The main reason for choosing this place as the campsite was because it is the turning point and confluence of a large river. There is enough fresh water and a large amount of fish, shrimp, and other aquatic products in the river. The forests in the north are another reason, as they can provide a large amount of high-quality wood. Coupled with the flat terrain, the east and south directions are mostly plains, making them very suitable for cultivating farmland. No matter how you look at it, this is a good choice. Unexpectedly, the subsequent progress and expectations are far from what you expected. Listening to David's description, Crawford couldn't hear anything magical or unusual. "Haven't you encountered anything special in the past 2 years? The most special thing is your appearance." Upon hearing David's answer, Crawford felt very helpless. It seemed that she needed to think in a different direction. "Take a good night's rest. Even if you want to do something, you have to wait until tomorrow morning before we talk." As they chatted, the sky had turned dim yellow, and David needed to prepare for the upcoming night. Except for the wooden house used for the warehouse and kitchen, the other 3 wooden houses all have the same structure and layout. A large room with a place to start a fire in the middle, and simple beds placed around the fire. David spent the past 2 years in such a simple environment during winter. According to the plan of the pioneers, this simple wooden house was only a temporary residence, but it was never able to cultivate farmland, making it difficult for everyone to build their own wooden house. As a result, there are only a few temporary wooden houses here until now. This kind of wooden house has poor insulation, and to pass the night safely, a fire needs to be lit. David now needs to move the necessary firewood inside. Crawford was also helping, but while the two were carrying firewood, they almost simultaneously noticed a faint shadow appearing on the open space not far from the village. "Is this another one here?" End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Passing by an old Buddha again. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. Passing by an old Buddha again. Crawford watched with his own eyes a semi-transparent figure that could only see a blurry shape at first, gradually becoming clear and real, finally gaining a more intuitive feeling of the situation described by David earlier. No wonder David had that kind of reaction to this incredible sight. Compared to Crawford's attention to how his figure gradually became real, David carefully scrutinized the newly emerged person, wanting to see if he could recognize who the new person was. The result disappointed him. When the other party finally revealed their true appearance, David couldn't immediately recognize who this middle-aged man, who looked exceptionally strong and had a big beard, was. When David and Crawford were looking at each other, the middle-aged man also noticed the two of them and noticed something. He stopped his steps and looked around with a wary expression. "May I ask where this is?" The middle-aged man asked in a language that David had never heard before, but David found himself able to understand the other person's words. He even thought of how to answer the other person's question in this unfamiliar language at the moment of listening to the question. After a brief moment of silence, I carefully pondered in my mind and soon realized that my newly acquired language is also called the lingua franca, but it is not the same language as the human lingua franca used in this world. As for his sudden mastery of a new language, he suspected that Crawford's initial reward was not simply English knowledge, but rather some more powerful ability. "Hello, this is the pioneer camp located in the northern part of the Kingdom of Tiran. I am David, the village chief here. May I ask if there is anything I can help with?" David answered the other person's question using the new, learned, common language, which surprised Crawford very much. Crawford has a language talent comparable to cheating. She has heard of David's previous use of the common language, which is clearly two completely different languages from what David is currently using. After hearing David's answer, the strong man across from him showed a clear expression of doubt on his face. Tiran Kingdom. After pondering for a few seconds, he asked again, "How far is this from East Wilder?" "I don't know where you're talking about, East Wilder." David shook his head and said he had never heard of this place before. In his heart, he speculated that perhaps the people who came to him inexplicably were not necessarily familiar to him. The other party's enthusiasm had already made the strong man let go of his guard, but David's answer made him even more puzzled. "Stan Som. The Kingdom of Lordaeron. Have you heard of these names?" David didn't show any reaction on the surface, but he was surprised in his heart. He is very familiar with these two place names, but it is inconvenient for him to directly answer and say he knows, while constantly guessing the identity of the person in front of him in his heart. Seeing David not speaking, the strong man's thick eyebrows twisted even harder. He decided to introduce himself first and then ask for more information. "Hello, my name is Lao Fo, I may be lost. Maybe I need to stay overnight in your village." As one of the most famous paladins in Azeroth, he is not unfamiliar with mysterious powers and suspects that he may have encountered some kind of spatial shift. "I don't know where I was sent." From the young man's recent reaction in front of him, it is highly likely that he has left the Eastern Kingdom. The old Buddha was pondering the strange things he had experienced here, while David was surprised in his heart by the identity of the strong man in front of him. I didn't expect this famous paladin to come to him too. While recalling various information about the old Buddha, David silently organized his words, preparing to directly tell the paladin in front of him the actual situation. There is no need to hide some things, and the other party is not a fool. Even if David doesn't say it, old Buddha will soon discover something is wrong. It's better to directly tell the other party about various situations, which can also be considered as showing one's attitude and improving one's favorability. If the Buddha is willing to teach him how to use the holy light, David will make a profit. He doesn't think the holy light has much power, but rather its excellent ability to treat and eliminate diseases. In this relatively backward world, David, who lives alone in remote areas, is most worried about not getting timely treatment for his injuries and illnesses. There used to be no other way, but now that the holy night of old Buddha appears in front of him, if he doesn't grasp it well, he will appear too foolish. I need to explain some situations to you. Describing the miraculous appearance of the old Buddha and the example of Crawford, who also came here from another world, David easily explained the situation clearly. Old Buddha's acceptance speed is also faster than Crawford, because he comes from a world that often fights with people from other worlds, and his acceptance of other worlds is much higher than Crawford's. Isn't this Azeroth? Old Buddha grabbed his slightly messy hair. He didn't expect that he would get lost and go straight to another world. No wonder this young man named David hasn't heard of the Kingdom of Tiran. But why do you understand the language used by Azeroth? I don't know either. It seems like I have some peculiar ability, and when I saw you, I suddenly understood this language. After a while, David had already figured it out. Crawford can learn a new language in a short period of time through various incomplete records on ancient relics and stone tablets. The reward I initially received from Crawford is likely an upgraded and enhanced version of this ability, rather than the English knowledge he initially guessed. This discovery made him very happy, and the appearance of the old Buddha confirmed his speculation about his own golden finger. He activated the golden finger after becoming the village chief. This means that more people from all over the world will appear in the future. After possessing this ability, he no longer has to worry about language issues. David was ecstatic in his heart, and old Buddha didn't find his explanation unacceptable. He just looked at David a few more times. As the few people spoke, the sky had completely darkened. The old Buddha had already noticed that Crawford and David were moving firewood into the wooden house, so he took the initiative to help. The three of them quickly prepared enough firewood, raised a fire in the wooden house, and then surrounded the campfire to talk. Crawford doesn't know the common language of Azeroth, while old Buddha doesn't know English. David is needed as a translator for their conversation, but overall it doesn't have much impact. After chatting for a while, Crawford had completely believed in the fact that she had come to another world, and the appearance of the old Buddha shattered the last trace of doubt in her heart. The suspicion in his heart completely dissipated, and coupled with the recent series of shipwrecks, heavy blows, stabbings, falls into mountain streams and other disasters, after completely relaxing, Crawford quickly fell asleep. David helped Crawford make an extra blanket and then sat back on his bed to continue chatting with old Buddha. The old Buddha did not describe his past great achievements, but only said that he had left home for some reason and was wandering around without a fixed place, only to come here in a confused way. If you don't mind this place, you can stay in the village for a long time. Listening to old Buddha's description, David finally understood the other party's current situation. In the plot of the Warcraft story, old Buddha was exiled due to conflicts with his subordinates and helping and rescuing an orc. After wandering around for a period of time, he chose to live in seclusion in a certain place in East Verde. East Verde was renamed a more well-known plague place due to the ravages of natural disasters and epidemics, which was also the reason why David had previously stated that he had not heard of East Verde. After so many years, this detail has long been forgotten. That sounds like a good suggestion. Old Buddha didn't resist David's invitation. At this moment, he didn't really want to go anywhere, he just wandered around. If he didn't agree immediately, it was just that he couldn't let go of his wife and son at home. Now that he was in a confused state in another world, he couldn't help but think about how to go back. After all, when he was exiled, he was still in Azeroth at least, missing his wife and children and secretly returning to take a few glances. I don't even know if I can go back and take a look at this situation now. The old Buddha stopped talking, and David also lay on the bed. In the big wooden house, only the fire occasionally made some noise, and his consciousness gradually became blurred. When he woke up again, the sky was already bright. David sat up, the nearby fire was still burning, and the prepared firewood had been used up. It was obvious that someone was watching the fire all night. No wonder you can sleep until dawn. It's impossible to sleep soundly on your own days. Besides getting up from time to watch the fire, you also need to be careful against the attacks of wild beasts. Last night was different. Surrounded by a powerful and well-mannered paladin like the old Buddha, he didn't have to worry about his own safety at all. It's been a long time since David felt so at ease. Just as he was wondering where the old Buddha had gone, the door of the wooden house was opened, and more sunlight shone into the room, making Crawford wake up. First, he sat up vigilantly, then remembered his magical experience. Crawford pulled out a helpless smile and said good morning to David. Good morning, David. Good morning, Crawford. The old Buddha standing by the door saw that both of them were awake and greeted them, saying a surprising message. Good morning, both of you. I think I know how to return to my own world. What? Through David's translation, Crawford, who understood what this sentence meant, was very excited. She was the one among the people present who most urgently wanted to go back. What should we do? It's simple, just find a direction and leave the village, thinking deep down that you can go back to your own world. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. The old Buddha decides to stay. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. The old Buddha decides to stay, thinking of returning to his own world and walking in any direction towards the outside of the village, Crawford said with an incredulous expression on his face. So simple. Yes, the old Buddha nodded and said, I just tried a few times, and it's really that simple. After discovering a way to freely travel back and forth, old Buddha became much more relaxed. He had nothing urgent to do. As long as he could go back when he was thinking about his wife and children, it didn't matter where he was. Even in another world. As for, will this world threaten Azeroth? He hasn't noticed this possibility yet, maybe he can stay and observe more. David didn't know that old Buddha already had the idea of settling down here, although it had a hint of surveillance. Even if he found out, he didn't care. As the protagonist of that world, Azeroth is suffering from various invasions, so it is not surprising that the people living there will worry about this issue. It is also because of this reason that David really has no ideas about Azeroth. That world is too chaotic. Even if he has the ability to invade other worlds, he will not choose that world. Besides, he has no ability to travel to other worlds at all. How did he come back? Compared to Crawford's concern about how to return to his own world, David was curious about another question. How did the old Buddha come back after returning? Just like that, as long as you think in your heart that you're here, you're here. The simple David was a bit speechless. Are you just looking for a direction to walk in? It's even simpler, you can take a step in place. The old Buddha's face, full of big beards and majestic, showed a bit of humor. He just gave it a try at the time, but didn't expect it to be really useful. Listening to old Buddha's subsequent narration, David had understood that for those who had come to his place, as long as they thought about his place and made a walk posture, they could come over, which was much simpler than returning to their world. On the contrary, if you want to leave, you must go outside the village, in any direction. Just circling around the village is ineffective. I'll give it a try. After listening to the introduction from the old Buddha, Crawford didn't even feel in the mood to have breakfast, so he immediately left the wooden house and randomly chose a direction to move forward. David followed quickly to the outside of the wooden house, then stood at the door and looked at Crawford running towards the distance. He wanted to see what it was like when Crawford left. He didn't wait too long, and soon saw Crawford's figure becoming semi-transparent, somewhat absent, until it gradually disappeared, basically reversing the way they appeared. So it was like this when I left. The old Buddha saw it for the first time. After all, he couldn't see himself appearing or what he looked like when he left. How did you feel when you left? David was curious. In this seemingly vague state, what did Crawford and old Buddha feel? The answer turned out to be completely different from what he had imagined. I don't feel much. In fact, I'm just walking, and in a blink of an eye, I'm in another place. This spatial transfer has no process, just like he takes a step forward and the surrounding environment changes in the next second. At this moment, Crawford's figure appeared again outside the village, still the elusive figure gradually becoming clearer, finally revealing his appearance. It's really amazing. Similar to the old Buddha, after realizing that he could freely travel back and forth, Crawford no longer hesitated about not being able to go back. Instead, he was curious about this magical situation and wanted to find out what was going on. What is the reason for all of this? There may be something mysterious hidden near this village, such as ancient relics, altars, and so on. However, she still remembers having partners, perhaps waiting until they reunite and rescue personnel take them away from the island before studying the issue. Without any worries in her heart, Crawford naturally became troubled by other problems on her body and became hungry. It's not just Crawford who feels hungry, but old Buddha is also very hungry. As a guest, he feels embarrassed to search everywhere for food, and he's not sure if there is enough food storage in this seemingly simple village. You should know that as a powerful paladin, he has a great appetite. After thinking for a while, the old Buddha suggested, "Go around and see what prey there is." "No need, there's still deer meat I hunted yesterday in the kitchen, enough for the three of us to eat." That's a whole deer, and he and Crawford didn't eat much together yesterday. Now, with the meat from old Buddha, it's more than enough to make breakfast. David brought the two of them to the wooden bucket where water was stored. He took out a wooden basin and a few clean cloth towels for them to wash up. Then, the three of them cooked a sumptuous breakfast together. Roasted deer meat and a small portion of soup made with wild vegetables. The three of them had a very happy breakfast. David has the motivation to continue working hard, build the village, welcome more people from all over the world, receive rewards from them, and learn special abilities such as the holy light. Crawford knows how to go back, and with David's help, she can definitely come and seek help when in trouble, but she doesn't know if she can bring her companions over for shelter. At the same time, I became curious about this magical and unfamiliar world, and only waited for safety before coming here to explore the truth. The old Buddha thought this was a good place to live in seclusion. No one knew him here, and he could live a peaceful and stable life. He could also go home and visit his wife and children whenever he wanted. After finishing breakfast, Crawford said he was ready to go back and meet up with his friends first, and then find a way to contact the rescue personnel. "Bring this." Upon hearing that Crawford was about to depart, David took his spare hunting bow, a barrel of arrows, and a short knife and handed them to Crawford's hand. "You've been attacked by strange people before, and that island looks very unsafe. You can also defend yourself with weapons. Insert the short sword with a sheath into his waist, with the shaft behind his back." Crawford, holding a hunting bow, gave David a warm hug and said, "Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here and meet you. You don't need to be so polite." From enjoying it a bit at the beginning to feeling a bit awkward, David, who slightly arched his body, didn't have the idea of pushing Crawford away. He sighed in his heart that it would be better if he could hold her for a longer time. Crawford, who had a hint of redness on his neck, didn't say anything more. After releasing David, he turned around and left the village holding his hunting bow. David remained motionless for a while, then straightened his back and saw the old Buddha looking at him with a smile on his face. "What's going on?" "It's nothing. Did you say earlier that you welcomed me to stay here for a long time? Was it a simple polite remark or a serious one?" "Of course it's really welcome." David was very happy to hear this, and he really hoped that the old Buddha would stay, only to get along more and have the opportunity to learn various knowledge of the holy light from this paladin. Even without mentioning the knowledge of the holy light, David needs sufficient population to develop the settlement into a formal village in the Kingdom of Tiran. Originally, the barren land, harsh climate, and extremely remote geographical location made it difficult to attract farmers to settle here. However, if we change direction, David can definitely attract people from other worlds to live here, such as the old Buddha who wants to live in seclusion. Please take good care of the village chief in the future. David reached out and shook hands with old Buddha's big hand. In the moment of shaking hands, David felt as if he had changed, but upon closer inspection, he did not notice any change. Illusion. Putting this matter aside, David introduced the general situation of the village to the old Buddha, but there was actually not much to say. For temporary wooden houses, 3 of which were inhabited by people, with the same internal structure, a room is used as a warehouse, kitchen, and blacksmith shop. To the west of the village is a large river with abundant aquatic products, to the north is a forest with many wild vegetables, fruits, and beasts. So far, David has not delved deep into the forest, only circling around the periphery, so he is not sure how dangerous the deep forest is. Both the east and south are plains, but if you keep walking along the riverbank to the south, you can reach the Iron Tree Forest. Iron Tree Forest is located on the northwest side of Iron Tree Castle and is an extremely vast forest, named after iron trees, a top-notch timber. It is the barrier between the Iron Tree Forest and the Tiran Mountains that prevented the Tiran kingdom from occupying this vast plain area for a long time. David's development camp is quite far from Iron Tree Castle and should be the northernmost area of the Kingdom of Tiran. If he could establish the village. There are only you and me in the village now. Although we lack crops to grow, we can still get enough food through hunting and fishing. After describing the general situation, David took the opportunity to express his plan. If we want to live long, we need to build new wooden houses. The old Buddha agreed with David's words and originally intended to suggest that he build several better houses. Not far away is the forest, and there is no shortage of wood here. Although houses built with stones are better, old Buddha is not a stonemason. It's okay for him to build a wooden house, but he really doesn't know how to build a stone house. There are some tools at the blacksmith's shop. Although the blacksmith took a large number of tools with him when he left, there were still many things left behind, which were enough for David and Buddha. The two of them were talking while carrying tools and preparing to go to the forest. When David was holding his bow and arrow, he found that the feeling he felt when holding the bow was different from before. He took out an arrow and placed it on the bowstring, then pulled the bowstring to make an aiming motion. What's wrong? It's nothing. In a short time, David was certain of something. He didn't know when he received the reward from Crawford again. Why are you sure it's Crawford? Because the Holy Knight, old Buddha, seems to have little connection with bows and arrows, while Crawford's main weapon in the story plot is bows and arrows. Speaking of which, the strange feeling I had when shaking hands with the old Buddha before is not necessarily an illusion. I wonder what reward the old Buddha gave me. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Superb Archery Talent. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Superb archery talent. I'm not sure for the moment. David's heart is full of roast about his golden finger, which is so unclear. He has to think hard about it. How good is it to give a system directly? It doesn't need to be too complicated, even if it's just a prompt interface, it's clear and straightforward at a glance. The golden finger is not awesome. Along with the old Buddha, we arrived at the edge of the forest and watched towering trees stand before us. David withdrew his chaotic thoughts and thought slowly about things like golden fingers and rewards when he had time. For now, let's study how to build a house. These are all high-quality woods. The old Buddha observed carefully for a moment and determined that these woods were very suitable for building houses. After all, he is a paladin who has led the army and fought against the orcs. He often commands his subordinates to cut down trees and build camps, and he still has this vision. The next step is to chop down trees. This is not an easy task. They not only need to chop down each big tree, but also clean up the branches on the trunk, and then push the entire thick round wood back into the village. Although the village is not far from the forest, there is still a certain distance. David looked at the thick trunk and didn't know if he could resist it. By the way, there's something I forgot to ask. The old Buddha was still looking around and saw that the trees here were all very thick, and the forest was so vast that he couldn't even see the edges, which meant they didn't have to worry about whether the wood was enough or not. What's going on? What is the name of our village? David was stunned when he heard this question, as he had never considered it before. Although the pioneer camp has been established for nearly 2 years, due to the unsuccessful development process and the continuous reduction of members, it has never been able to establish a real village, so the village has not been officially named. Due to various questions, there has never been a formal name for the village. After answering the Buddha's question, David also took the opportunity to think about what name should be given to the village. I didn't think about this before. It was at that time that he wanted to give up. Now that he has decided to persist and has also thought about the direction of development, the village name needs to be determined as soon as possible. Not only for the convenience of introducing to those who will come later, but also for the official village name to be filled in on the development certificate, so that it is convenient to report to the official kingdom in the future and receive various rewards. That's it. The old Buddha had already selected a big tree and swung his axe to start logging. Then you need to come up with a good name. I will think carefully and come up with a name. David also took out his axe and prepared to start chopping trees, but after a few cuts, he found that his efficiency was far behind that of old Buddha. His current physical fitness is not poor, otherwise he would not be able to withstand 2 winters. As a hunter, he never lacked meat since childhood, and with years of exercise, it can be said that he is much stronger now than his past self. But compared to humans who have degenerated from the steel life created by Azeroth and Titans, and old Buddha who has been baptized by the holy light, that is a super weak chicken. The old Buddha finished chopping down a tree and clearing all the branches and leaves, while David was still struggling with the first trunk. By the way, there isn't much food stored in the village. I think we should collect and store more food. The old Buddha saw that David's physical fitness was much worse than his own, but he still waited until David cut down the first big tree before giving his suggestion. David knew that the old Buddha meant well. The efficiency difference between the 2 people in chopping trees is too obvious. It's better to take separate actions and do different tasks, without affecting the progress of chopping trees while ensuring that there won't be a shortage of food. Then it's up to you. Don't worry, this kind of work is very easy for me. The venerable old Buddha did not resist the rough work of chopping trees. Since I am determined to live a relatively ordinary reclusive life, I can no longer consider myself the Lord of Hearthpeace Valley in the Kingdom of Tiran. The current old Buddha is just an ordinary farmer, ready to create a new life with his own hands. Upon thinking about it, he felt that chopping down trees was not so boring, and even became more dynamic. The speed at which the big tree fell became even faster. David, who was separated from the old Buddha, moved westward along the edge of the forest. The river is in this direction, walking along the edge of the forest to the riverbank, and then heading north along the riverbank can ensure that you don't get lost while also making it easier to discover large animals. This route is not absolutely safe, so David always holds the hunting bow in his left hand and stays above the quiver hanging on his side waist in his right hand, making it easy for him to take out the bow and launch an attack at any time. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of a shadow passing by. With my right hand, I immediately pulled out an arrow and completed the action of setting up an arrow and aiming in the shortest possible time. In that moment, David felt as if everything in his sight had slowed down, and at the same time, the less clear shadow became clearer, even magnified a lot, making it easier to see. Not only that, there was a feeling that seemed to make him realize that he needed to move a few centimeters further to the left, which was the correct center of gravity. With his thumb releasing the bowstring he held, as the arrow swam away towards the target, David even had a feeling that he would definitely hit the target, without the need for any more knives. Everything that followed was just as he felt. The arrow accurately hit a wild chicken, decisively killing the prey. From David pulling out the arrow to the moment the wild chicken was shot and killed, it was all in the blink of an eye. Good guy, my archery ability has improved a bit. Even though there had been speculations earlier that he had gained archery ability from Crawford, he never expected such a huge improvement. Apart from the surprise, he thought of one thing. It seems that my talent in archery was not very good originally. The gap between me and this skilled archer who can use bows and arrows to kill the entire opponent's organization is really too big. I thought I could become a hunter, but I have some archery talent. On second thought, even though his talent was lacking, with the help of constantly appearing people like Crawford and old Buddha, his future was quite bright. Retrieve the arrows and hang the wild chicken on his left waist. David is preparing to continue collecting food. In addition to meat, he also wants to find more wild vegetables, mushrooms, wild fruits, etc. to ensure the diversity of food in order to live a healthier life. Although meat is delicious, no one can stand eating it alone. He was lucky enough to pick some mushrooms and berries. Even if he had to squat down and pick them one by one, he didn't have any impatience, only a full stomach of happiness. Just as he was happily picking berries, he suddenly felt that the situation was not right and reacted immediately. Throwing down a handful of berries in his hand and throwing them towards the side, then picking up the hunting bow at his hand and rolling over to pick them up. Although stained with a lot of soil and grass, it looked very embarrassed, but it perfectly avoided the attack of wild beasts. It was a sturdy gray wolf. David saw clearly what kind of beast was on the other side, and immediately glanced around. Sure enough, he found more gray wolves in the grass, behind trees, and other places. Slowly moving his position, David moved towards the river to avoid being attacked both inside and outside. The gray wolf across from him seemed to sense his thoughts and rushed forward again while David was still moving slowly, while the arrows that greeted the hungry wolf flew out almost in no particular order. David, who has been a hunter for so many years, cannot be said to have no exceptional skills. He is very skilled in rapid shooting, able to grab 3 to 5 arrows at once, shoot them all in the shortest possible time, and ensure that these arrows hit within a circle about the size of a human head. Now he has received a reward for his archery ability from Crawford, who can even compress this range into a fist-sized circle. When he focuses on aiming, it seems like he is in a slow mirror state, which means David can better lock in and shoot targets, even if they are moving at high speed. It was easy to defeat the first enemy, but now was not the time to slack off. David immediately drew 2 arrows from his quiver, and this time his targets came from 2 different directions. His mental concentration was high, and the slow mirror-like image gave his brain enough time to make judgments. The wolf on the left had already jumped up and made a pounce, while the wolf on the right was still charging, and the distance was also further away. Although this state cannot make David's physical movements faster, it can allow him to make the best judgment in an instant to complete the kill. Left first, then right. 2 arrows were fired one after another, although none of them were fatal. It also stopped the momentum of the 2 gray wolves from charging forward, buying David some time. In just 1 or 2 seconds, several arrows immediately flew over and hit the 2 gray wolves to complete the kill. David's movements were very fast. At this moment, he didn't retreat but instead advanced, rushed to the gray wolf he had shot to death first, reached out and pulled out the arrow that had pierced the wolf's body, followed by another round of rapid fire, shooting and killing another gray wolf. David, who had completed consecutive kills, reached out for the arrows. However, when he arched again, the wolf pack had already turned its head and entered the forest, all running away without a trace. Running so fast. The highly tense spirit relaxed slightly, and David watched his surroundings with caution. He then packed the scattered berries, tied several gray wolf corpses together and carried them on his back, then cautiously walked back along the riverbank. "Thank you, Crawford." After confirming that the gray wolves had not caught up, David let out a sigh of relief and once again thanked Crawford for providing him with super archery abilities. At the same time, he also looked forward to various magical rewards provided by the old Buddha and even those who were about to appear in the future. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Holy Light. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6 Holy Light. Returning to the place where the trees were chopped with a pile of harvest, I saw that the old Buddha was still busy here, but several simple processed woods had already been placed around. The old Buddha also collected the cleared branches and leaves together, which are all good firewood and need to be transported back to the village. "Are you back?" The old Buddha took off his shirt and bared his upper body, revealing his powerful muscles. You look like you're in trouble. David carried the corpses of several gray wolves on his back, and his body was also stained with soil and grass leaves. It was obvious that he had encountered a pack of wolves and engaged in a fierce battle. Putting the axe in his hand on his shoulder, the old Buddha carefully examined David and said, "Are you injured?" "My luck is good, I haven't been injured." If it weren't for luck to obtain the golden finger and then acquire Crawford's archery talent, with his original strength, he would definitely be injured or even lose his life. "Oh!" the old Buddha exclaimed in surprise. With David's physical fitness, he not only did not get injured when encountering a pack of wolves, but also killed several gray wolves. It seems that David's archery skills are very impressive. The wounds on the body of the gray wolves are very obvious, and each gray wolf has more than one arrow wound. Facing multiple targets, he can hit several arrows on the same target, not only accurately but also quickly. It seems reasonable to think about it. Without some strength, David wouldn't be able to live in this place, let alone become the last person to explore the campsite. But there will be trouble in the days to come. Although David's strength has greatly increased, and old Buddha is also a powerful paladin, he is not worried about direct conflict with the wolf pack, but the wolf pack's retaliation is often day after day, endless, day and night sneak attacks. Even if two people can handle it, they will still feel annoyed when constantly harassed. Of course, the old Buddha knows the habits of wolves, and there are also such creatures in the world of Azeroth. It's really a trouble. However, the powerful old Buddha is not worried. If the wolf pack thinks he can sneak an attack while chopping trees, then it is a big mistake. Even if the old Buddha stood here and let the gray wolf take 2 bites first, it wouldn't be him who fell down in the end. On the contrary, David, even though his archery skills are good, his physical fitness is average. If he suddenly encounters a surprise attack, he may be in danger. With this in mind, old Buddha put forward a suggestion that made David very happy. "I have a special power that can help you better deal with various troubles. If you are interested, I can guide you on how to master this power. If you can learn to use this power, you don't have to worry about the gray wolves in the forest." David's previous words did not fail to bring the topic to the aspect of the holy light, but his initial intention was to start the conversation. After the Buddha mentioned the power of the holy light, he expressed his desire to learn from it. He didn't think the old Buddha would refuse, because the Holy Light Church is a very open-minded sect, and under the leadership of Archbishop Alonso Fao, the priests in the church have been working hard to spread the path of the holy light to the entire Azeroth. Basically, if you are willing to learn from them, you are willing to teach. Before becoming a paladin, old Buddha was also a pastor in the Holy Light Church, and spreading doctrine and teaching believers the holy light was his original job. In this situation, David expressed that he wanted to learn the holy light, but the likelihood of old Buddha rejecting it was very low. Unexpectedly, the development of the matter went even smoother than David had anticipated. The old Buddha voluntarily offered to teach David the holy light. "Oh! What kind of power is it?" "That is a righteous force full of warmth and light, which can heal pain, dispel diseases, and also help you fight against evil. Of course, dealing with ordinary beasts is also no problem. The holy light belongs to one of the fundamental elements that make up the world in the world of Azeroth, but it does not mean that there is no holy light without that world, as many worlds have the basic element of light. This type of energy property generally has positive and positive attributes, but of course, this does not mean that this force is just, as David is well aware of. But he won't argue with the old Buddha about what the holy light is at this moment. Be a quiet little novice of the holy light, listening to the Buddha describe the various wonders of the holy light and the teachings of the Holy Light Church that occasionally blend in. Through the explanation of the Buddha, David learned that the Holy Light Church is a group that encourages people to be kind and actively face life. The pastors in the church will work hard to help various people who encounter difficulties. From handling family disputes, to combating bandits and bullies, and even the evil forces in a crisis world. It is precisely because steadfast acts of kindness are more likely to gain recognition from the holy light and thus master this magical power that during this period of Azeroth, the users, followers, of the holy light and the messenger of justice were equated. Having said so much, you should have a basic understanding of the holy light. The old Buddha talked a lot, and the most important thing was to make David have enough understanding of the holy light before he could truly teach. By the way, after telling David the way of perceiving the holy light, the old Buddha's face was full of uncertainty. But I'm not sure if you can perceive the holy light. Do you want to try it now? Now they are not in Azeroth, and he is not sure how far this world is from Azeroth. He is really unsure whether David can grasp the holy light. There are several speculations about David's study of the holy light. After studying hard, David gradually realized the holy light. David, through his efforts, has never been able to perceive the holy light. David's talent was astonishing, and he quickly realized the holy light. Either way, he doesn't think David's attempt at this point will yield results. But when David knelt on one knee, with his back straight and his hands resting on his knees in front of him, and closed his eyes to contemplate the holy light, something completely unexpected happened to the Buddha. A golden light slowly emanated from David's body, gradually becoming clear and bright from the beginning, and soon being enveloped by the golden light. As a paladin, this kind of radiant Buddha is most familiar. How could this be possible? Not only did David grasp the holy light on his first attempt, but what old Buddha couldn't understand even more was what this scene before him meant. David realized that the holy light brought about the baptism of the holy light. But this phenomenon is completely different from what he was familiar with before. Whether it is a paladin or a priest, after sensing the holy light, a beam of light will descend from the void. The priest or paladin who bathes in the holy light will be baptized by the holy light and become a follower of the holy light. The holy light in front of him did not descend from the void, but emanated from David's body. Although it was still weak and not strong, the old Buddha could never admit it wrong. The old Buddha, who seemed to be overwhelmed by a question mark on his head, couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation for the scene before him. Could it be that David in front of him was actually the embodiment of the holy light? Holy light, is this a test for me? The old Buddha seriously suspected that when he came to this world in a daze and met David, a special presence in front of him, it was actually the holy light testing himself to see if his faith in the holy light was still firm enough. At this moment, David, with his eyes closed, did not know that the old Buddha had been stunned. He was still immersed in the joy of successfully mastering the magical power of the holy light. David, who didn't know how special his own situation was, immediately felt the holy light slowly emerging from his body after closing his eyes and following the Buddha's instructions. The feeling was like a hot spring emerging from deep inside his body, and then this warm current slowly flowed throughout his body. The location where it flowed seemed to be washed away by the warm current, making him feel extremely comfortable all over. This feeling is even more comfortable than taking a shower or killing chickens. Not only did David's fatigue disappear, but he felt as if his body had been reborn, because all the discomfort left by the past 2 years had disappeared, and even his strength seemed to have increased. At the same time, his brain became clearer and his mind became unusually excited. All these changes allowed David to enjoy for a while before reopening his eyes. "Old Buddha, what's wrong with you?" "No, it's nothing." The old Buddha didn't say anything about David's abnormality. He felt that he now had more reasons to settle here. "I just didn't expect that you would quickly realize the holy light. Few people can do this." This kind of reply is not perfunctory. There are many pastors in the Holy Light Church, and many paladins in the Silver Hand have also been trained. However, the vast majority of people need to undergo strict teaching and training before they can truly appreciate the holy light. Only a very small number of beings can immediately gain the favor of the holy light while choosing to step into it. Really? It seems that my talent in this area is quite good. At the same time, David immediately realized what reward he had received from the Buddha. Holy light talent. He is very self-aware. He doesn't think that countless heroes in Azeroth's world cannot immediately master the power. He only listened to a few explanations from the Buddha and could immediately master it. The only reasonable explanation is that his golden finger has made contributions. This is not just good, it's that simple. The old Buddha sighed, and then he didn't rush to teach David how to use the power of the holy light. Instead, he carefully asked David about his feelings, such as whether he had any special feelings after realizing the holy light. I feel like some of my minor ailments have disappeared, and it seems like my strength has also increased. It seems like my spirit has also improved. Listening to David's description, old Buddha was roughly certain that David had mastered the holy light, which was no different from the holy light he had used, except for the slightly different scene he had just seen. Not only that, but with the protection of the holy light, you can undergo more rigorous physical training, greatly improving your physical fitness. There is currently no abnormality, and the old Buddha is preparing to teach David how to use the holy light according to the normal process. As for whether to focus on the use of the holy light or to hone your body to learn the use of various weapons, it depends on your personal interests. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Wait for me to add a buff for you. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. Wait for me to add a buff for you while carrying firewood and wood. While listening to the old Buddha explain the direction of practicing the holy light, David understood that both paladins and priests are simply followers of the holy light. Although there are some differences in the use of the holy light, it is not as clear as in the game. The real world of Azeroth does not have as many complex skills and talents as in games. To some extent, the power and nature of the holy light are there, as long as you are willing to explore and practice it yourself. Even if you are a paladin, you can master the skills of a priest. Similarly, the opposite is also true. So what old Buddha said was to choose the direction of his practice based on David's interests, rather than saying that he must choose a direction and then cannot change it. So, which direction are you interested in? I'm quite interested. David is already an adult, no longer a child, so he all wants to say, life here doesn't have anything important to do. I have enough time to learn all kinds of knowledge about the holy light. Ultimately, it all boils down to the understanding and application of the holy light, as well as the improvement of one's physical fitness and the use of various weapons. There are only 3 main directions, and if one has nothing to do, they can all be learned. That's not a problem. For old Buddha, David's desire to learn was not a problem at all. Before becoming a paladin, he was originally a renowned priest. Azeroth. Among the first 5 paladins, except for Gavinrad Doom, who was a knight of the Stormwind Knights, the other 4 were all pastors of the Holy Light Church. Considering that David's current physical fitness is relatively poor, old Buddha believes that before improving his physical fitness, David does not need to rush to practice cold weapons such as heavy hammers and double-handed swords. Instead, he should prioritize learning how to correctly use the holy light to treat, eliminate diseases, and protect himself, in order to better ensure his own safety. As for the holy light spell that leans towards attacks, David can learn it temporarily or not. With his archery skills, he is capable of handling most of the current situations. In the following time, the two of them traveled back and forth between the village and the forest, while teaching the basic knowledge of the holy light. David learned very quickly, and after trying a few times, he almost immediately learned how to use the holy light for healing and defense. After several round trips, his stamina was exhausted, and the old Buddha taught David how to use the holy light for recovery when his stamina was depleted. Similar to when he realized the holy light, he still knelt on one knee and supported his knees with both hands. This time, the Buddha saw that the holy light on David's body did not come from himself. Like most ordinary followers of the holy light, a beam of light descended from above, covering David's entire body. Standing there observing for a while, the old Buddha stopped staring. Taking advantage of the early sky, he decided to quickly transport all the wood back. While the old Buddha was transporting the wood back and forth, David felt this warm energy constantly swimming around his body. Almost every time it flowed, it would eliminate some discomfort in that part of his body. As time passed, he felt the warm current in his body constantly strengthening. He realized that this prayer-like state not only restored his body to its optimal state, but also made the holy light in his body stronger. This should be the way the holy light user meditates, right? As he guessed in his heart, he opened his eyes again. As David woke up, the beam of light that enveloped him slowly dissipated, like scattered golden raindrops. As it slowly fell, it gradually dissipated and disappeared. At this moment, the old Buddha had just returned the last piece of wood with good luck and said, "Oh, wake up. How do you feel?" Unprecedented. David clenched his fist slightly and felt his strength increase again. I don't know if it's an illusion. Thinking of the old Buddha's previous statement that users of the holy light can polish and exercise their bodies as they please without worrying about hurting themselves, perhaps this is not an illusion. Just as David wanted to inquire more about the knowledge of the holy light, he saw a figure appearing outside the village, somewhat absent. Someone has arrived. The old Buddha stacked the thick and long wooden materials together, and when he heard David's words, he followed his gaze towards the outside of the village and also noticed the figure. Is it Crawford? I don't know. Before the figure fully solidified and revealed its appearance, it was impossible to determine who the newcomer was. David also had a headache about this. What if there was an unpleasant, even supervillainous guy? Fortunately, so far, the two individuals who have appeared are absolutely upright, and their golden fingers may have some filtering function. At this moment of speculation in my heart, the figure outside the village had already revealed its true appearance, not as a newcomer, but as Crawford, whom both of them knew. Crawford, what's wrong with you? Crawford didn't look very good. Her body was stained with mud and water, making her look a bit embarrassed. At the same time, her hands were tied together and she was carrying them behind her back, and her face was full of panic. David, help me. Crawford cautiously ran to David with his hands on his back, and saw that David had already drawn a short knife from his waist. He immediately turned around and handed his trapped hands to David. David carefully cut the rope and let Crawford turn back to face him before continuing to ask, what happened? After all, his past life had passed so long that he could only remember Crawford and the general plot, unable to remember all the details. It was only when he saw Crawford with his hands bound that he gradually remembered some of the details. After finally meeting up with my friends, we encountered some strange guys. Crawford took a few deep breaths to calm his mood as soon as possible, and described the general situation in the simplest language. After listening to it, David's mind also flashed with corresponding images. These memories buried deep in his mind can still be remembered as long as the keywords are triggered. Don't panic, let's first think about what to do. After listening to Crawford's description, David had a clear understanding of his current situation. This was the first time Crawford had encountered a true enemy, and it was no wonder she had looked panicked just now. In the original plot, if it weren't for being pushed to the brink, Crawford wouldn't have grown up in just a few days. Now it's different, because of the special place of David in his village. Crawford has a way out and a person to seek help from, so she didn't choose to stick to the Sun Brotherhood in the first place. After learning about Crawford's situation, the old Buddha immediately expressed his willingness to help. In the eyes of this paladin, it was just a group of robbers and not a troublesome matter. But things were not that simple. After 2 simple attempts, old Buddha and David were certain that they couldn't go to Crawford's world. Even if Crawford tried to carry David, the ultimate result was that when Crawford's figure turned semi-transparent, David fell directly to the ground. What should we do? After tossing and turning several times, Crawford finally realized that neither David or old Buddha could help her, and she could only rely on herself. After losing her way out, Crawford's inner strength gradually awakened. She glanced at the bow and arrow at David's hand and said she needed to borrow it. My bow and arrow were taken by those guys. Can I use your bow and arrow? Of course it can. Looking at Crawford, whose face was full of determination, the familiar archaeologist seemed to be gradually taking shape. Besides that, I can also help a little. Oh. You see, you can freely enter and exit my place, which means you can escape danger at any time. David suddenly had a strange feeling that his place seemed to have become a safe zone, providing food, water, and even equipment. Some of the unreasonable things in the game seemed to make sense. Pushing down the strange feeling of becoming some kind of NPC, David continued, besides, I just learned some very useful abilities from old Buddha. When David said, you can escape danger at any time, Crawford felt more confident. I didn't expect David's next words to shock her even more. Even if you're injured, as long as it's not so serious that you'll die immediately, old Buddha and I can help you heal. Just as he was about to ask more clearly, David had already raised his hand and pressed it on Crawford's shoulder. With the golden light flashing on David's hand, Crawford, who was already carrying various minor injuries, felt a warm current flowing into his body from David's hand, accompanied by the warm current flowing through his body. Surprisingly, all the discomforts on his body disappeared. What happened? Lowering his head, he examined himself. Not only did the scratches on his arms disappear, but he even opened the bandage on his waist and looked at it. Crawford's face was full of disbelief. The penetrating wound on his waist had actually healed, without even leaving a scar. What did you do just now? What the old Buddha just taught me is a power called holy light, is it incredible? David was like a bare child who had received a new toy, showing off fiercely. It's amazing. Looking up at the flickering light in David's palm, Crawford felt that there were more and more things beyond her imagination here. At the same time, she did not ignore the content revealed in David's words. This power was given to David by old Buddhism, which means it is the power of old Buddha's world. Is it too late to ask the old Buddha if he can learn this power himself? David gave a new surprise. Not only can it heal, but this power can also protect you from harm. David, like a peacock with an open screen, raised his hand and infused a large amount of holy light into Crawford. These holy lights would form a shield on Crawford's body, protecting him from external damage. In addition, the energy of the holy light can also help Crawford maintain abundant physical strength for a certain period of time. With the protection of the holy light, you can easily rescue those captured companions. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Village Names. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8 Village Names. After briefly introducing the spell effects he cast on Crawford, his face was filled with surprise and curiosity. He seemed a bit eager to give it a try and see if this so-called holy light was really so magical. Watching Crawford's figure disappear again, David turned his head to look at the old Buddha standing next to him and said, I may not be able to rest tonight. The plot on Crawford's side has officially begun, and the next few days will be a continuous battle, which means that Crawford may come to seek help at any time. It's okay, I've been used to similar situations for a long time. The old Buddha didn't think this was any good. Prepare more water and food, maybe you need to prepare some bandages and medicine. Water and food are easy to understand. After a series of battles, Crawford definitely needs to replenish food and water. But are drugs and bandages still needed? As long as Crawford can walk smoothly to David and old Buddha, no matter how many injuries he has suffered, he can be healed by the holy light in a short period of time. After pondering for a few seconds, David realized that the medicine and bandage were not prepared for Crawford, but for his companions. From the current perspective, whether coming to him or leaving to return to the original world, there is no way to take care of people. Therefore, even if Crawford's companions are injured, they cannot come to David and old Buddha for treatment, so they naturally have to rely on medication. I'll take out all the drugs first, so that Crawford can take them away when needed. The old Buddha planned to go to the river to fetch more clean water and also mentioned that there is currently a lack of important facilities in the village. A water well. David could only reluctantly spread his hand and said, there are so many facilities missing in his village. It can't be said that there is nothing, can it be said that there is nothing to ask for? All facilities, including water wells, remain on the schedule. Put the corpses of a few wolves into the warehouse first, simply process the berries, and then David continues to cook dinner with deer meat. Wait until the deer meat, mushrooms, and a little berry are all thrown into the pot and cooked, then turn around to deal with the corpses of those wolves. By the time he finished various tasks, the old Buddha had already run back and forth between the village and the river, filling all the utensils used to store clean water. Then he lit a bonfire in the wooden house where he lived and watched David carrying a pot full of stewed meat into the room. Eating stewed meat, listening to the Buddha continue to explain the knowledge of the holy light, and waiting for the possible arrival of Crawford at any time, this night should be the most fulfilling one David has ever had in the past 2 years. In the past 2 years, at first, I was able to chat and fart with my friends at night, longing for a better future, but as time went on and life became increasingly bad, there were fewer and fewer friends around, and the few who stayed behind also lost the mood to chat. Every night became the most unbearable time, until David was left alone, and this agony reached its peak. Unexpectedly, David waited for a turning point at such a time, not only welcoming new companions, but also mastering various magical abilities. Especially the knowledge of the holy light that he is currently learning, which he could only enjoy in games in his past life, but this time he can personally experience and unleash this magical power. Your affinity with the holy light is very high, and your understanding of the holy light is also very thorough. The speed of progress is very fast. After teaching for a while, old Buddha once again exclaimed about David's talent. If David's progress speed is always so fast, it won't be long before he will surpass himself in his achievements in the holy light. If this kind of words were spoken to people in the world of Azeroth, most of them would not believe it. After all, old Buddha was one of the first 5 paladins, and their achievements in the holy light had already been recognized by the wise life of the whole world. It is such a powerful existence, but it is believed that David will soon surpass himself, which shows how amazing David's talent is. On just the first day of learning the holy light, David was already able to use this power very well. He also learned how to use the holy light to heal, eliminate diseases, protect himself or others with the holy light, use the holy light to increase his or others' physical strength, use the holy light to directly attack, and so on. Am I learning fast? David looked at the golden energy in his palm. Even though he knew it was a cheat, he couldn't help but feel a little proud. The speed of progress is no longer just fast, the old Buddha sincerely praised David. In fact, most newly graduated pastors may not have the same understanding of the holy light as you. That is to say, in less than a day's effort, David went from being a layman to a qualified novice pastor. The rest is persistent practice. Old Buddha originally wanted to say something to prevent David from becoming too proud and relaxed, but in the end, he stopped talking. In addition to wanting to see David's character, there was another reason why Crawford came. Using more will naturally lead to more insights. David also turned his head to look at Crawford as he opened the door and walked in. He could clearly feel that the holy light he had previously applied to Crawford had been exhausted. It looks very smooth. Apart from the consumption of holy light, there was no damage to Crawford's body, not even much dust and soil, and a smile was on his face. Have you solved those robbers? Although it was not completely resolved, we finally managed to deal with the current crisis. Crawford placed the hunting bow and arrow barrel he was holding next to David. This is the bow and arrow we borrowed from you just now. In addition to the bow and arrow placed next to David, Crawford also carried another pair of bows and arrows on his back, a large bag in his other hand, and a pistol inserted in his waist. It is obvious that in addition to regaining the previously stolen weapons, she also obtained some additional spoils of war. I came here this time mainly to put these things with you. Putting down the big bag in his hand, he explained to David what was inside. This is a handgun, these are bullets. A handgun is a weapon that can shoot this. This is this kind of bullet. You must not turn the muzzle, towards yourself. David listened to Crawford talk about various precautions while putting on a look of, oh amazing. The appearance of. Compared to him, the old Buddha next to him is much more dedicated. After understanding what this is through David's translation, he exclaimed with heartfelt emotion, "It's a very exquisite firearm." After saying various precautions, Crawford packed enough ammunition and prepared to depart again. Before leaving, she cautiously asked, "Can you still use the spell you used before?" "Of course you can." Upon hearing David's answer, Crawford's smile became even brighter and she felt more stable now. After experiencing it firsthand, she realized that as long as there was protection from the holy light spell applied by David, she would be fearless. After taking a simple sip of meat soup and drinking some water, Crawford watched as David lifted his hand and released a golden glow. After the glow condensed on himself for a moment, it gradually faded away. With full confidence, he waved goodbye again and left with his head and chest held high. Watching Crawford's departure, David casually observed a 2-second silence for the members of the Sun Brotherhood, and then chatted with the old Buddha while tinkering with the firearms that Crawford had brought back. There is a mysterious force on the island where Crawford fell, which can destroy planes and ships that intentionally or unintentionally enter the surrounding waters. Therefore, for countless years, survivors of the disaster have been continuously drifting to the island. These people have various identities, including those carrying weapons or teams. In addition, during World War II, the Japanese army also stationed troops on the island, so there is no shortage of firearms and ammunition on the island. The bag that Crawford brought back only had 3 pistols and bullets, and no long guns. After tinkering with it a few times and figuring out how to operate it, David couldn't help but brainstorm. I wonder if it's possible to attach a holy light to the bullet when shooting. What effect will it have? You can try it tomorrow after dawn. As for now, Crawford had just left and shouldn't have run back immediately. He is very energetic now and can't sleep at all. Continue to learn about the knowledge of the holy light. The old Buddha just said, the next important thing is to practice diligently, probably because it is difficult to understand deeper knowledge before one has more insights. So what else can we do? Suddenly remembering the topic of the day, I happened to bring it up for discussion. Old Buddha, what do you think is a better name for the village? The old Buddha, who was tinkering with a pistol, was momentarily stunned when he heard David's question and said, "What is the name of the village?" "It seems like you should decide, right?" In the eyes of the old Buddha, this village is David's territory, and the power of naming naturally lies in David's hands. David wants the village to be called what he wants it to be. And you have lived here for a while, you should have thought of a few names, right? Old Buddha guessed that David didn't give a name, but he didn't know which name to choose. "I did come up with a few names." David's words made the old Buddha mutter to himself, and as expected, he immediately asked what their names were. I can give some advice to David for reference. Nyoja Village. It sounds a bit strange. David muttered to himself, this is the center of the universe. But upon careful consideration, I'm afraid I can't use such a domineering name recklessly. Xianya Mountain. The old Buddha hesitated for a moment and said, is the nearest mountain the peak to the north? If we use this name, the village is too far away from the peak, isn't it? My village. This sounds good. Seeing David suddenly silent, old Buddha looked strange and said, what's wrong? What's wrong with this name? I suddenly feel that this name is not very auspicious. If I use this name, will I die suddenly and not even leave a descendant behind? Besides, David didn't really want to use these names. He just casually mentioned a few village names to liven up his thoughts and come up with a name that suits the characteristics of the place. Located in the north. The weather is cold and the earth is freezing. Suddenly, an even more ominous name came to mind. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Mars Visitors. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9 Mars Visitors. After pondering for a few seconds, David did not choose to simply copy it, but rather made a slight change, which completely changed the meaning and should not be associated with that unlucky family. Lingdong Village. It sounds good. According to your previous description, this name reflects the characteristics of this place very well. Old Buddha learned from David that this is a very cold area, and winter is particularly difficult to endure. Since you also think it's good, let's call it this name. David took out the pioneering order he always carried with him and wrote the village name, Lingdong Village, on it. The big river next to it can be called Lingdong River. David, who was trying to save time, also gave the name of the nearby river. Anyway, according to the laws of the kingdom, he has the right to name this river. If two development teams name the same river, it is up to the kingdom to decide which name to use as the official name. David doesn't think this situation will happen this time. There is no development team from the same group that has traveled further north than this one. As for the river that flows out from the Iron Tree Forest from south to north and eventually joins the Winter River, it is possible that it will be named by another development team. Watching David carefully put away a few strokes on a scroll, the old Buddha curiously asked, "Does this become a territory recognized by the Kingdom of Tiran?" No, David shook his head and said it wasn't that simple. To become a formal village, at least you need stable housing, fields that can sustain food production, and a certain number of villagers. We also need to report to the department specialized in handling such matters with a development order, and then the relevant department will send officials to conduct on-site inspections to determine the situation of the village before summarizing various information, including newly drawn maps, into archives for reporting. Finally, a formal appointment will be issued to the village chief, at which point it can be considered as truly opening up new land for the kingdom and becoming an officially recognized small lord of the kingdom. So troublesome. The old Buddha didn't expect that the appointment of a village chief would be so cumbersome. Because the situation is quite special, isn't it? The person who holds the development order to establish a village cannot be considered an ordinary village chief, because they have great autonomy and even have the qualifications to expand and upgrade the village, which is completely different from the village chiefs within the kingdom. If the village can expand in size and reach a sufficient population within the prescribed period of time, it can be directly promoted to mayor, and this land will also become its territory. So it's like this. Strictly speaking, David can barely be considered a small lord, but he has not yet become a formal one. It is precisely because of these benefits that David joined the development team. However, at the beginning, he didn't expect to become the village chief. At that time, he wanted to see if he could become a knight, which could be considered a departure from the common class. Now, his thinking has become very simple. Since he has taken up this position, he needs to sit more steadily, and he has started to think about how to make the village develop. At present, his biggest reliance is on the golden finger, which attracts people from all over the world. As long as he makes good use of it, the current problems are not difficult to solve. For example, if the land is barren and crops are difficult to survive, he can ask Crawford to purchase high-yield crop seeds that are cold-resistant and easy to survive in her world, and even ask her to develop some fertilizers and other things to improve the land conditions. He can also wait until his relationship with the old Buddha improves, and ask the old Buddha to seek help from the Druids to get some special seeds to improve the land conditions. Even if neither of these two methods works, David is not prepared to give up this place. He can't be a food base and can't do anything else. As long as you can maintain the normal use of Sumitomo's fingers, it's possible to send him a super genius someday, and it would be quite interesting to set up an industrial base then. I just don't know what minerals are nearby. After daydreaming for a while, David fell into a daze, and when he opened his eyes again, the sky was already slightly brighter. Turning his head to look beside him, the fire was almost extinguished, and the old Buddha was resting on his own bed. The water, broth, and weapons and medicines placed next to him had not been touched. It seemed that after falling asleep last night, Crawford had not come back. Getting up from the bed, David added some firewood to the fire to make it even hotter again, and then hung a large pot of broth on the campfire. When he washed up and returned, the broth was ready to eat. Stepping out of the cabin, breathing in the cold air, David briefly moved his body and took some water to start rinsing. By the time he finished washing up, old Buddha had already gotten up and was moving his limbs in front of the wooden house, just like David did before. However, compared to David, old Buddha's activities looked much more fierce. If he were swung by those thick arms, there would definitely be no good outcome. Do you have any plans for today? After the activity, the old Buddha wiped his face with clean water and asked David about his plans. Yesterday, I chopped a lot of wood, and David also hunted several gray wolves. Both food and wood are not lacking. Perhaps we should consider building a house. Or, dig a well first. If you want to build a well, do you need stones? The old Buddha was not very clear about how to make a well, but in his impression, a well requires stones. When it comes to professional stonemason work, both of them remain silent. Let's build a place to live first. Anyway, there are only 2 people living in the village for a long time. Going to the river to fetch water is just a bit troublesome and not an urgent problem that needs to be solved. On the other hand, if we cannot build a sturdy and warm house as soon as possible, we will suffer again in winter. Just as David was considering whether to wait for Crawford to solve the problem and return to his home in England, asking her to bring him building materials such as cement, bricks, and glass to build a beautiful and comfortable house, that elusive figure reappeared in his sight. Crawford. David and old Buddha saw this situation and their first reaction was that Crawford had come over again, but it wasn't long before they realized they had guessed wrong. The figure gradually became clear, and both of them had good eyesight. It was immediately clear that the person coming was not Crawford, but a man. It seems that a new person has appeared again. Old Buddha knew that there was only Crawford in front of him, so this stranger was the new person who appeared for the first time. Carefully scrutinizing the newcomer, he was of an ordinary height, with a normal appearance and a somewhat strange outfit. At this moment, he was looking around with a bewildered expression on his face. Quickly, the other party noticed David and old Buddha standing in front of the wooden house and walked over without hesitation, saying, "Hello, may I ask where this is?" "Hello, this is Lingdong village, and I am the village chief David." David was still looking at the other person, who had a familiar appearance, but he couldn't determine his identity for a moment. "Hello, I'm Mark Watney." Mark Watney reached out and shook hands with David, as if to be sure of something. He shook David's hand a little harder, and a hint of doubt flashed on his face from time to time. "This is... My name is Lao Fo." David serves as the translator. "Hello." Mark shook hands with old Buddha again and then asked David, "Where is the village of Winter?" "May I ask?" "This is the northernmost region of the Kingdom of Tiran." "I know you want to ask where the Kingdom of Tiran is, and I will briefly explain various situations next." After sharing the situation with Mark Watney, the newcomer immediately fell into a huge self-doubt, feeling like he was crazy or just dreaming. Watching the reaction of the person in front of him, David carefully recalled the information about Mark Watney. From the other person's face, David could tell that this Mark Watney was the protagonist of the movie version of Mars Rescue. In the Mars Rescue film, Mark Watney, a botanist, landed on Mars as a member of a Mars exploration mission. However, in an accident, he was believed to have died by his teammates and was forgotten on Mars alone. The entire film tells the story of how Mark Watney survived and waited for rescue in the harsh environment of Mars. As for Mark Watney in front of him, David's observation confirmed that it was not Mark who struggled to survive on Mars for a period of time. At that time, Mark was thin and had many illnesses due to insufficient nutrition intake. Is this a joke, right? Or am I dreaming? If this is another world, why do you speak English? Mark rubbed his temples and kept asking, still not believing that he had inexplicably come to another world. This language called English was something I just learned a while ago, and before you, someone who spoke English came to me. Suddenly learning a new language or something sounded unbelievable, and David just changed the way he described it, making it much easier to accept. Sure enough, with just this explanation, Mark no longer hesitated about language matters, but continued to be shocked by how he ended up in another world. However, this doesn't seem like a bad thing to me. Thinking about the dilemma he was about to face, he felt that perhaps God was helping him and giving him new life. Having come to this point, Mark, who was naturally optimistic, no longer hesitated. A smile reappeared on his face, and he solemnly reintroduced himself. Mark Watney, a botanist and NASA astronaut, was currently working on Mars exploration before coming to you. I encountered some small troubles and may need your help. David listened to Mark's introduction and guessed what state Mark Watney was currently in. The period just forgotten on Mars. Can you elaborate on what kind of trouble it is? If possible. I would like to stay in your village for a while. End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Rewards in the Wild. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Rewards in the Wild. Stay for a while. David knew why Mark Watney said that. In the plot, he was accidentally forgotten on Mars and could only live alone on this planet with nothing. His driving force for survival is to wait for the next manned mission to Mars in 4 years. How to spend these 4 years is the biggest challenge he currently needs to solve. Not to mention whether the residential camp can withstand a full 4 years without damage, and whether the oxygen and water equipment can work normally for 4 years. For Mark Watney at this time, the biggest challenge is food. There is enough food stored inside the base for 6 astronauts to use for 68 days. Even if there is only Mark Watney now, this food can only support him for 300 days, and the appropriate limit can last up to 400 days. This is still far from 4 years. It was at this moment that Mark, who was pondering how to plant enough food on Mars for him to eat for 3 years, arrived at David's winter village in a daze. At this moment, Mark Watney saw a new hope. If what David said was true, he could freely travel between 2 worlds, and he could completely live here, while finding a way to reunite with the next batch of astronauts coming to Mars and return to Earth together. So, is there anything inappropriate for David to take in Mark Watney? Of course not. So David directly expressed his welcome. This is not a problem, welcome to the winter village. Apart from that, Mark Watney is a botanist and may be able to help himself solve the land problem. Or do you want to acquire some botanical skills from him? Reaching out his hand and holding Mark, he welcomed him. David didn't feel like he had suddenly learned any knowledge, and he didn't know if his favorability was not high enough. David is not in a hurry. If he is right in his judgment, Mark Watney will be staying with him for at least a few years. Whether it is botanical knowledge or anything else, he is not in a hurry. At the worst, Mark Watney is at least a big living person. To become a formal village chief, he needs a certain number of villagers. In David's plan, when Crawford helped him obtain seeds for high-yield crops and solved the most basic agricultural and food problems, he would go to Iron Tree Castle to recruit a group of villagers. If there were already people living in the village before that, it would undoubtedly be more convincing to persuade more people to stay. So, even ignoring the gains brought by the Golden Finger, Mark Watney only stayed for a few years before leaving, and he was very welcoming. Mark Watney is currently not aware of these things, and even if he knows about them, he doesn't care. As long as he can urgently solve his survival crisis, everything else is just a small matter. Upon hearing David's welcome, Mark couldn't even close his excited mouth. He didn't know if he was feeling hungry, but he seemed to smell the scent of meat. He soon realized that it was not because he was hungry that he had hallucinations, but because there was really a pot of broth waiting for him. Our Lingdong village is located in the northernmost part of the kingdom and is a newly established village. There is nothing good about it, and we hope you don't mind it. Watching David bring the steaming broth in front of him, Mark smiled even more brightly and said, how could that be? Thank you very much for your hospitality. If possible, I also hope to be of some help. Mark doesn't want to become a freeloader and has started thinking about what he can do. In his opinion, although he doesn't know how he came into this world and doesn't have a good understanding of it, based on the current observation, the civilization of this world seems to be in a relatively backward stage. He should be able to use some advanced knowledge to make this village better. Having breakfast, Mark expressed that he would like to visit Lingdong village later, not only within this village with only 4 wooden houses, but also to take a look at the surrounding area. Of course. David had no reason to refuse, while old Buddha said he wanted to take a walk in the forest to the north. David knew that old Buddha was worried about the wolf pack that had attacked David before and wanted to go over to see if the hidden danger could be completely eliminated. Of course, he would not object to this. Just as a few people were having breakfast and deciding what to do next, Crawford ran over again. When Mark Waltney held a wooden bowl and saw a person appear in front of him from scratch, the last bit of doubt in his heart disappeared for the most part, and the last bit of doubt was left to him. This may just be a bizarre dream. This option. Hello, my name is Crawford. When Crawford introduced himself to Mark Waltney, the botanist from Mars had a strange expression on his face. He held it for a few seconds before introducing himself to Crawford. Hello, my name is Mark Waltney. Not a single one present was a fool, and old Buddha was even more of a human spirit. Although he currently does not understand English, after these 2 days, he has learned that Crawford's simple greeting and self-introduction were enough to make Mark Waltney react in this way. This situation is very interesting. David knew why Mark had this reaction, but he still acted very innocent, as if he didn't know anything, watching the excitement from the side. Crawford also realized something, but with some experience, she didn't rush to ask. At this moment, she had more important things to deal with first. After asking for some food and water, and having David make up for various buffs for himself, he hurriedly left. Watching the golden light scattered by David's waving, Mark suddenly realized that he had not only come to another world, but also witnessed the mysterious power that once existed only in various magical works. What is this? Holy light. The familiar name suddenly made Mark Waltney realize that the possibility of him actually dreaming had increased a little. Watching David skillfully tidy up the dishes, Mark, who was following behind, carefully observed everything and occasionally secretly twisted his arms and thighs. No matter how hard he tried, the pain he felt didn't wake him up, and if he was really dreaming, the details would be too detailed and realistic. Wait a minute. While following David around the village, Mark seemed to have noticed something and called out to David, who was about to take him towards the river. I think I've found something. What's going on? David, who was stopped, froze for a moment and turned his head to see Mark sprinting towards the back of a wooden house. Is it a beast? Because the surrounding environment is not safe, David even keeps his weapons at hand during rest, let alone during regular activities. Reaching out to remove the hunting bow on his back, he heard Mark say, "No, I seem to have found potato sprouts." Ah! The hand preparing to hold the bow paused in mid-air, stunned as Mark Waltney carefully crouched on the open space behind the wooden house. After observing carefully for a moment, he finally looked up and said, "I didn't see it wrong, this is indeed a potato sprout." David really wants to say, impossible, to him. He has been living here for 2 years, how could he not have noticed the wild potatoes under his nose? Just as he was about to speak, after staring at Mark Waltney for a second, he suddenly realized something and his blurted rebuttal turned to. What is that? A food that is easy to survive and high yield. Mark didn't think much, thinking that people in this world didn't know the value of potatoes as food. This is not surprising, after all, in his world, humans didn't know for a long time that this thing could be eaten. And it was also delicious. Since wild potatoes can be discovered, it proves that potatoes can be grown here. Mark Waltney's original plan was to plant potatoes inside the Martian base, but there were too many troubles to solve for planting on Mars, and the probability of success was very low. By comparison, taking those live potatoes here and opening up a potato field in this world, continuously growing a large number of potatoes, can not only ensure one's own food, but also contribute to this village. It is simply perfect. Mark Watney, who was in a state of excitement, was no longer planning to continue his visit. He couldn't wait to start his potato field development plan immediately, and his mind had already begun to calculate how much land he needed to open up and where he should open up the potato field. Watching Mark Watney muttering incessantly in his mouth, David didn't interrupt the person's thoughts, but turned his head to look at the potato sprouts under his feet. The emerald green and tender branches and leaves grew on the black soil. Upon careful observation for a moment, David found that there seemed to be a subtle difference between the land under his feet and the land far away. Illusion. After taking a few more glances, he couldn't distinguish whether he was mistaken or not, or perhaps I didn't even notice such a small difference before. But one thing can be certain is that there were absolutely no wild potatoes in this place before. After living for 2 years, he never let go of the wild vegetables and berries that could be eaten and dug on the surrounding land. The crops under his nose cannot be ignored by him. Besides, he doesn't know potatoes. Since there was no such thing before, there is no reason to suddenly appear out of thin air. The most reliable explanation is Mark Watney, who is muttering and calculating something next to him. Does the reward not only include skills or talents given to people like me, but also actual objects like potatoes? David pondered. The reward for these actual objects should also have a special connection with the character who gives the reward, just like Mark Watney and the potato. In the plot, Mark relied on potatoes to survive on Mars until rescue arrived on Mars and successfully returned to Earth. However, it's easy to find these potatoes growing behind the house. If there's anything else strange, how do you find or claim them? End of this chapter.